So welcome fan addicts once again back to the vault of all things EC. Eagle-eyed viewers will probably notice that we are in a different vault. So pleased to have a special guest here. And I will tell you that this is the first time I've had anyone other than myself talking about one of these releases. So when these Fantagraphics EC Artist Library books come out, I like to talk about them, let you guys know about them in advance. Get advanced copies so I can give you a heads up, let you know when it's coming out. And this time, we've got Jon Gothold with us.
Hey!
He wrote the introduction for The Bitter End and Other Stories by Reed Crandall. So before we get too much into the book, why don't you just tell us how you got into Reed Crandall? How did you discover this stuff?
So, I like to think that I discovered Reed Crandall in maybe the way that the first generation Fan-Addicts did. So it came like out of the blue. And for me, it wasn't in EC. It was in EC's Evil Stepchildren, the early Warren magazines that came out in the 1960s. So I was 11 years old in 1967. And a lot of people remember the summer of 67 as the summer of love. For me, it was the summer of horror comics. A buddy of mine had a stack of these creepies and eerie's and blazing combats. And he says, you're going to really like these. And so we spent like a couple of weeks.
Now, did you or your buddy know that they had a connection to something older?
No.
Or was this your first exposure
to these artists? And so this is creepy number 6. And one of the first ones I ever read. And if you look at this splash page, this is an adaptation of Edgar Allan Poe's The Cask of Amontillado. And it was illustrated by this guy named Reed Crandall. And I was like, I was just speechless when I saw this guy's art. It was like, this guy draws better than anybody I've ever seen. And that was it. You're like, after
that to be your first exposure to, that's
an
unreal amount of line work and detail, and it is astonishing.
Yeah. And I think once you see Reed Crandall, it's like all the other guys kind of take shortcuts. All the other guys don't really draw as good.
How not as good as Reed Crandall? Where do they fall?
Exactly.
To Reed Crandall?
Yeah. So I was also collecting Mad at this time. And of course, Crandall, I didn't know it. Reed Crandall made one appearance in Mad in issue number 30. But I didn't know that at the time.
First Alfred E. Newman cover.
Cover. And so for me, it was like, who is this guy, Reed Crandall? And as I collected Mad, I started collecting other EC comics. And this would have been in the early 1970s. And so I was really attracted to shock suspense stories. I just thought that was a cool
Such a sampler of all their styles.
Yeah.
Great introduction.
So my first 2 issues of shock suspense stories, one of them was issue number 9, which has this guy being, a corpse being dragged through the desert with vultures, picking him apart.
Whatever that's about has got to be a great story.
This is going to be a great comic, right? And then the other one was shock number 16. And it's got a couple of guys. They've got a guy tied to a chair and they're just beating the crap out of this dude. And as it turns out, both of the lead stories in these 2 issues of Shock were illustrated by Reed Crandall. So when I get this Shock and I flip it open, it's like, Reed Crandall, it's like I'm all in,
So you were getting into this, and I guess you knew by that time that the guy in Creepy worked for EC.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, that was really
seeing it. You went, that's the same guy.
That's the same guy. That was the connection, because I really backed into EC horror stuff. I guess really through Creepy and Eerie and the Ballantine paperbacks, and Crandall. He was the thing that caught me. So then, as I was thinking about the book, the bitter end, and we start transitioning to EC. In 1972, as Tommy Burns has told us many times, there was a Fan-Addict convention that was held in New York City in May of 1972. And it was the first time that a lot of this original art had ever been exhibited. It was the first time that all of the EC people, collectors, all got together.
About it so much because it's unbelievable to think that this ever actually happened. So shout out to Bruce Hershenson, who's a member of our EC Fan-Addict group.
Indeed.
But I should mention, John is a fellow admin of the EC Fan-Addict Club.
Oh, yeah.
But shout out to Bruce Hershenson and Ron Barlow for putting on the EC Fan-Addict convention. And one of these days, no, I'll never stop talking about it. I can't imagine an event like that, but the fans that went to that seem to have an affinity for
Reed Crandall,
didn't they?
So to show you how much staying power Reed Crandall had for the original EC fans. So before the convention started, Ron and Bruce sent out a ballot to people that had pre-registered, and the ballot just basically said, vote for your favorite EC horror story, your favorite art, individual story, and your best overall horror artist. And then the same thing in science fiction: best science fiction story, best science fiction art, best overall science fiction artist. And you filled it in, right? You could write in whatever story you wanted. Now, to put this into context, in 1972, no EC reprints had been done yet. Nobody had these comics to refer to unless they bought them in the 50s. So if they remembered them from when they were kids.
In the decades since, there have been so many different formats to read EC stories in, so many different kinds of reprints. And at the time, you maybe had the paperbacks from the mid-60s.
Yep.
And you had maybe the big book if you got an advanced copy, but you were saying you got your copy through this membership.
Yeah, so the big book kind of came out along with the convention. I bought a membership at the convention that included the book, that included the big book. So anyway, my point is that people just going purely on their memory, and they selected for the best horror stories, they narrowed it down to 3. Reed Crandall's Swamped is one of the 3 all-time best horror stories, as voted by the Fan-Addicts in 1972. And then and that was for art. And then the best script for an individual horror story, there were 4 finalists, and one of them was Dog Food, also illustrated by Reed Crandall. And kids, both of those stories are to be found in this book, The Bitter End. So, talk about powerful stories that have stood the test of time. These were things that people remembered reading 20 years earlier and wrote them down on a ballot. And
this would have been second generation EC fandom.
Yeah.
And so, like you said, there were no available reprints. They were either going on memory, or a lot of these guys, like the second generation fans that were starting to put out these fanzines like Squatront and Spafon, and they had collections of original EC comics. And kind of like we got into them at roughly the same age, a little bit later, scouring for original EC comics. And the way you read these stories was by reading the original comics.
That's right.
And so this stuff stuck in their minds and stood out as the best of the best examples of EC storytelling. And with collections like this, with the EC Artist Library, they are grouped by artist. You see the best of the best. This is one of those books where, honestly, this is Crandall with EC Comics at the peak of his powers.
Yeah, it really is.
And it collects all. He didn't do a lot of sci-fi, right?
No, not a lot, but there's a bunch of them in here.
And this is horror and crime for the most part.
Yeah, horror, crime, shock, science fiction. For collectors, one of the best things in here is Reed Crandall did one 3D story for EC. It was a science fiction story. It never was published. And the only time that it ever saw print at all was in an early issue of Squatront, I think in the early 70s.
1970, that was number 4.
Yep.
And you would have to do some deep digging now to get it. But one nice thing about the EC Artist Library is they've taken all of these 3D stories that have never been reprinted, whether they were originally published, or in the case of this one, it was never published in the 50s.
Right.
And they collect them and group them together with the artist's output. So there's some really cool stuff in here.
Yeah, there's things that, it's not just stuff you've already got in all likelihood. There's definitely some things in here for everybody. Even the more advanced EC collectors are going to find stuff in here.
Well, one thing that kind of makes my head swell a little is when people say, well, what's so great about these? Because even if you have the stories in other formats, they're not collected this same way. This is the first time they've ever been grouped this way by artists, chronologically by artists, and then sort of, by genre. So there's a Wallace Wood war book and a Wallace Wood science fiction and Wallace Wood's shock and crime stuff. And it makes for a very interesting reading experience. So I'm sure you can speak to writing the introductions. I never read the stories that way. The first assignment I got for these was a Jack Kamen collection, and to read all Kamen and all one genre made the stories new to me, and finding things to say about them in that context really made it a new experience for me. So, you've done another one of these as well.
I have. I just happen to have it off camera. So the first introduction I did for this Fantagraphics library was for Code of Honor and Other Stories by John Severin. John Severin is another one of those artists that I've just been knocked out by ever since I was a kid. And I've collected John Severin comics since I started collecting comics, really.
Well, that could have been almost because Severin was working for the Warren magazines.
Yep.
You connect the dots back to EC.
Yep.
In my case, it was Cracked Magazine. I was very familiar in the 70s with John Severin.
Yeah.
And then to get the big book and see that ad for Mad Comics where Severin was pictured was my connecting the dots backwards to EC and going, whoa, holy crap.
Yeah,
All these guys are connected?
Yeah.
They all had to do with EC.
And Crandall came to EC a little bit later than a lot of these guys. He was about 2 years after, Wood and Davis and Ingalls showed up. And Crandall basically was interviewed talking about it. Like he realized one day, like, well, all the good guys are there. And so he just had to go there.
And there's a story. Was it Al Feldstein or was it Bill Gaines? One of them, he walked into the office and they said, we've been waiting for you to show up.
Yeah, exactly. I think it was Feldstein.
Where have you been?
Yeah, because I think Feldstein might have run into him, before EC. But Crandall was a little bit older than most of the other EC artists, and they all revered the guy. I mean,
well, that speaks to his talent too, because he had a career in comic books prior to EC. They were kind of wishing and hoping that he would show up.
Right.
And they felt like he was the one guy working in comics that was at their level or better that they didn't already have.
Yeah.
They had Wally Wood, they had Al Williamson, they had Graham Ingalls, they had Jack Davis. We don't have this guy. And I think Crandall and Evans, correct me if I'm wrong,
right,
they came in around the same time.
Same time.
Like 1952-ish, sort of in the middle of the new trend years. And it's funny because you're talking about looking at his art and going, whoa, look at this guy. My brother, Josh, and I collected EC comics together from a very early age. And as you mentioned, you didn't know what was inside. There wasn't a plethora of available reprints. So the way you read these stories for the first time was scoring an original 50s EC comic. And any issue that had Reed Crandall in it was a win.
Oh.
We'd go, oh,
just a huge
Crandall.
Yeah.
You'd go, oh, Russo's. Come on. But
now, speaking of Russo,
exactly, I did that on purpose.
That was a nice softball.
One of the things a lot of people ask about the EC Artist Library series is how are they going to do all the stories? Because they're collecting Davis, or they're collecting Ingalls, or they're collecting Johnny Craig in one volume. How are they going to get the other stories? This is how. So the Bitter End has all the Reed Crandall crime and horror stuff, but it's also got all the crime and horror stuff by George Russos.
Right. And Russos is,
as a bonus. That's how you include
stories. And I got to write the intro for George too, who I don't have like that childhood like.
He's got not one but two essays in his book.
That's right. It's a double win. But Russos is one of those rare EC artists that actually goes all the way back to the pre-trend years, along with Johnny Craig and Graham Ingalls and Al Feldstein, and made the transition into the new trend.
Before horror, before sci-fi.
Yeah. And I think, he was kind of a bit of a star in the pre-trend because there was a lot of guys in there that were not of his caliber. But what happened, and this kind of goes to what we were talking about with Crandall, like when Crandall showed up at EC, he was already damn good. Mm-hmm. Everybody was like, thrilled that guy walked in the door. And the same could be said of George Evans. But the other dudes were younger, Davis, Wood, Ingalls. Their early stuff's kind of funky.
Yeah, and you could see them develop.
Yeah, you watched them grow before your eyes. But Russos, he was probably in that camp of, he already kind of had his style. He was already as established. Yeah. And these other young whippersnappers just passed him by.
Yeah, and I think you can point to a few of the EC artists that were early in the new trend that didn't do enough to really be considered regulars.
Yeah.
And what happened to them was Jack Davis was developing by leaps and bounds and developing his style. Graham Ingalls, leaps and bounds, developing his style. Everything just became more and more. Whatever their style was, and in Ingalls' case, it was that oozy, drippy, desiccated, rotten kind of vibe, got more and more. And these guys went Not Crandall, of course, but
the Russos, yeah,
Russos or Ames or
Sid Check,
Harrison.
Yeah, Harrison.
You know, a few of these guys that really didn't develop, and then imagine a guy like Al Williamson comes in and just
yeah. Williamson comes in, he's like in his 20s, and he's just like, you know, doing all these Alex Raymond kind of things immediately, like right from the get-go.
Yeah. Which was another thing about Crandall that was so interesting is that he just jumped right in with both feet into the new trend of EC Comics, and he was right there.
Oh, yeah.
Just as good as the other guys.
Yeah.
Settled right in.
And, you know, Crandall was probably best known prior to coming to EC. He was doing Blackhawk, which was, you know, much more of a superhero, kind of a war themed and a little bit more rooted in reality than your typical superhero, but, you know, continuing character, more classic comic book stuff. For him to just like, you know, hit it out of the park immediately. And in fact, it turns out his very first story for EC was the one with the vulture, you know, the vultures and the dead guy. That was the first Crandall story. So, you know, he nailed it right from the very beginning and became a huge favorite, you know, with the fans right away.
And that story is in another Crandall volume from Fantagraphics, but A Kind of Justice, you were talking about this cover story with the guy getting the crap beat out of him. What's that all about? Well, got to read the story, A Kind of Justice. One of the most progressive, I think, you know, if you want to call EC an envelope pusher. Oh. This was one of those stories. Yeah. This was one of those stories. Dog Food and Swamped, which were voted, you know, in the early 70s as being among the greatest horror stories. Those are in this book. But A Kind of Justice, you and I, a few years ago, and you might not remember this, we had a semi-debate, a good-natured fan-addict debate about whether or not that's a preachy. And, you know, I think it definitely falls into those sort of, whether it wasn't really a social justice story, but it certainly was speaking about abuses of power, about police brutality, some things that in a 1950s comic book, kids weren't used to seeing.
Oh, no.
And the story opens with something very shocking.
Very shocking.
Lives up to the title Shock Suspense Stories, for sure.
And I figured when I read that, I was definitely a minor when I got that issue of Shock, right? So I was probably 15, 16 years old.
I first read that story when I was 10 in the big book.
And you know, without giving the whole plot away, let's just tell you guys that the story is about an underage girl who's been raped, and it's trying to find, you know, the person that did it and bring them to justice.
The outrage of the father, and then the townspeople.
And the townspeople, and they, so, you know, lynch mob kind of mentality.
Mob justice, right?
Right.
Mob mentality.
And it turns out that the mob was terribly wrong on who they fingered for this crime. And the ending is such a great surprise that I want you guys to read it in this book. But suffice it to say, like you said, Tommy, not your typical comic book story, not then and not now. And it was not exploited to be exploited. It was like, oh my God, it was disturbing. You know, it really made you think. And
so I actually, you know, at the time that we had this discussion, and I was leaving that out of my list of preachies, was because I had just written that chapter for Life and Legend of Wallace Wood.
And this was a Reed Crandall.
And that's Crandall.
Yeah.
And then, you know, if you go back and read that, I was very cute about it because I said that the monkey, illustrated by Orlando, some call that a preachy too, because I was really pushing this Feldstein Wood did the preachies. But honestly, the fact that there's blurred lines of what's a preachy and what's not, and for those of you who are unaware, preachy was the nickname that they gave their more progressive social justice stories, because they felt like they were preaching, but it was very progressive, extremely atypical of what you would find in a comic book now, but especially in the 1950s, right. And kind of laid the groundwork for it. So these stories, you'll see the seeds of much more progressive graphic literature that came out since then, whether it was comic journalism or you know, even things like Art Spiegelman, Mouse, was a huge EC fan. Enough so that he was on a panel at the EC Fan-Addict convention, and this was the roots of that mentality. I think these stories made something like that possible.
Yeah, led to the Pulitzer Prize.
Hey, it's not too late for this book.
It's not too late. That is true. You were talking about the fact that, like, when you read these books and you're following an artist in a particular title, in a particular genre, and just watching them build upon the story that they did last month, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's the feeling you get, when you're reading these books. And with Crandall, I think what gives his stuff so much is how he's so incredibly gifted as a draftsman, and his stuff is so realistic. And I think a really good example of that is this image on the back cover here. Here's a guy getting hit by a car, and he's getting hit by the car. The
what
tire,
an amazing choice for the back cover image, too.
Yeah, the tire is running over this guy's guts, and he's shrieking. A lot of other artists, this scene would have been like off camera. You wouldn't have even seen it. You might have heard sound effects and like, oh my God. And, but Crandall puts you right there. So when guys get hit by cars, when people get beat up.
Well, there's a story in here where there's a description of a guy dismembering the corpse of another dude.
Yep.
And without going into the details of the plot, the first couple pages just describe the dissection of this corpse and the disposal of the body parts. And there's a point where I think the main character has to go to the laundry sink and retches. And I remember reading that story when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And I got a copy of Crime Suspense Stories number 24.
Uh-huh.
And I'm reading this story, and I was ill.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it made you sick. And the way that Crandall illustrates, by contrast, and again, when you can see the work of one artist grouped like this, spoiler alert, one of the upcoming volumes is going to be Jack Davis Horror Stories. And one of the things that I did the introduction for that one and was able to talk about how Davis would temper the brutality with an almost comic sensibility. Yeah. Some of the stories almost could have fit in Mad Magazine if some of the horror element was backed off a little bit. And some of them were almost silly. The story where the husband invites over his work friends and they trample his wife's prized garden, and the way she handles him with his brand new barbecue was almost comical. And some of the drunkenness depicted and the partygoers and the revelers were kind of funny.
Uh-huh.
Crandall's not funny.
Not funny.
The stuff that's depicted here is honestly, he was so realistic and so, I guess you could say he was no nonsense about it. I mean, look at the cover where whether or not you know what the story is about, that's a dude with a bag of heads. It's a bag of decapitated heads, but they're not. Their eyes aren't rolled back. Their tongues aren't hanging out. They're not funny, and
no, it's terrifying. And the people are terrified.
Horrifying.
Yeah.
You don't know what's going on with this guy until you read the story Swamped, which was voted as one of the very best horror stories by the Fan-Addicts of 1972. That's a panel from that story, and whatever it is, look at the sweat and the eyes popping out and the terror on this guy's face.
Dude's drowning in what looks to be a quicksand, and he's suffocating. So
and he's going down.
Down.
But that kind of realism was, whatever it was with EC, the combination of talent was unreal. We've talked about these guys being grouped together and watching them grow and develop, but also just the fact that they were corralled together at the same time and place.
And each guy was given
what made
the right thing for his talents.
Unbeatable, right?
Yeah. I mean, with Davis, I think that they purposely would give Davis the stuff that was the most over the top, almost ridiculous in its consequences. Because if anybody could pull that off in a way that wouldn't make you just hide and lose your lunch, it would be Jack Davis. With Crandall, he did a lot of stories about, unfaithful spouses, guys losing their temper and just, taking vengeance out.
Jealousies or double crosses or backstabbing or
just kind of like small Arthur Miller kind of moments. And they're in his hands, they will haunt you. Because they are so damn believable.
Seriously, I mean, Johnny Craig, EC artist, gets a lot of credit for his comic noir sensibilities and how that the lights and the darks and the very noir. Crandall same kind of thing.
Oh yeah.
His crime stories were very, and even the horror stories had that element of just like darkness and realism and the seedy underbelly.
Yeah, the underbelly of the big city,
So let's take a look inside though, because there's some real special stuff here. I mean, your introduction, that photo of Reed Crandall. We can't talk about this book without talking about the fact that I got my copy in the mail and looking at the special thanks just to see your name and my name and Roger Hill's name next to each other. I mean, talk about emotional experience for this book to come out right as we find out that on December 6th, we lost Roger Hill. And I mean, if anyone, who did more than him to advance knowledge and appreciation of Reed Crandall?
I mean, Roger Hill literally wrote the book on Reed Crandall. There is one book, it's definitive, and Roger wrote it. And one of the things about Crandall, unlike a lot of the other EC artists, is there's darn few photographs of him at all. And Roger spent years researching his Reed Crandall book and told me authoritatively, I probably have every photo of Reed Crandall.
So what's interesting, because I don't know if you saw this, because it just happened today or yesterday on the EC Fan-Addict Club page, but it wasn't me that posted about this. Someone else posted about this. And someone said, oh, well, there's no known photos of him except for this one of him in his 20s. It's the one they use on the Wikipedia. Is the only known photo of Reed Crandall. I said, no, there's tons.
Oh, no.
So this one you got from Roger Hill.
I got this one from Roger. So this is Reed Crandall in the EC era, posing next to, Roger's not sure if it's his car or just a car that he liked. But let's just think it's Reed's car.
Damn fine car.
Yeah. And he's, I mean, the expression on his face, he's just like, yeah. I mean,
Master of all he surveys.
He really was. And when I got Roger's book, I mean, this picture really stuck with me. Like,
me too. We never talked about this either.
No,
that picture you went,
never saw a better photo of Reed Crandall. So when I got the assignment to write this book, it's like I really wanted to have a great photo of Reed. When I did the Severin introduction, I had met John Severin in 1998, and I took a photo of him. And my photo is the photo that's the introduction for the Severin book with Crandall, like good luck finding a picture. So this was the one I had my heart set on. And I called Roger and I asked him, I said, hey, working on this intro, it's for Fantagraphics. What do you think? Would you be willing to let this photo appear in this book as well? And Roger, always the gracious guy, and certainly a guy that always wanted to advance Reed Crandall, says, of course I would. So I put
that was Roger.
That was Roger.
I mean, he did the deep digging, and he was always happy to share, and he was so supportive of the other fan addicts. And when he, it's like animals that kind of sniff out their own kind, and he would realize, oh, you're an EC fan? Oh, you really know your stuff. You really love this stuff. And then he was your best friend for life.
That's really true.
Helpful, giving, anything you wanted. We have Roger Hill to thank for that.
Yeah, that light fixture.
EC light fixture. That was on Jack Kamen's table at the 2000 Great EC Reunion
in San Diego.
And somehow Roger ended up with the centerpiece from Jack Kamen's table, and there it is. But that is another example of Roger would go, oh, you love EC? You love EC as much as I do here.
Yeah.
Here.
Yeah. I think, Tommy and I were talking about this just a couple of days ago. It's like Roger was such a cornerstone figure for us, with Squatron, and learning so much about EC history through the fanzine that he and Jerry Wiest and Bob Barrett did in the 70s, 60s and 70s. Yeah. And so for us to not only have gotten to know who he was, but know him and meet him and hang out with him and ultimately contribute to his latest EC fanzine, which was called EC Fan-Addict.
Oh, just seeing our names in that special art show edition. And
yeah. Published by Roger Hill.
That's my name.
I wrote an article for Roger Hill, So it's kind of like I wrote an article for Fantagraphics. I mean, it's an equally exciting thing.
And the timing of this, it's timing you would never want to have, but what are the chances, it's as we memorialize and remember him, And here's this brand new book that's about to come out.
Yep.
You write the introduction. We got Roger in there, helpful with a Reed Crandall project.
Yep.
And what a again, timing you would never want to have, but it's such a beautiful thing. And I'm not kidding. I looked in the book and I went, Jon Gothold, Tommy Burns, Roger Hill, and I almost had to just
all talking about Reed Crandall.
Yeah, unbelievable.
Yep.
So we're going to try to do it justice and carry on this legacy.
Yes, indeed.
So
yeah. So buy it.
Yeah, it comes out on, I think the official release date is
December 27th.
7th.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a couple days after Christmas. So depending on when you're watching this or how quickly we can get it together, you're either going to want to pre-order this or go ahead and just go get yourself a copy right now. But the best stuff that comic books have to offer, in my humble opinion, and this was one of the best of the best.
You'll like it.